Is a dogma lesson just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to TEFLology, a podcast about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by three self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL News. In today's news segment, we're going to be talking about drug-smuggling TEFLers being arrested in South Korea.
Yes.
Have you heard about this story at all?
No, I haven't, actually, no.
I've heard stories in the past about TEFLers in Korea being accused and demonized as horrible drug smuggling demons.
Yeah, demons, yeah. Yeah.
Teachers, right?
Teachers, yeah.
Teachers,
Okay.
yes.
TEFLers, teachers.
Not real demons. They're actually teachers.
TEFLers.
Okay. Well, as it happens, drug offences are taken very seriously in South Korea. So if you're caught using drugs, any kind of drugs, even what we'd consider quite minor drugs like marijuana, you can be given 5 years in prison or fined up to 50 million won. I don't know what that means in like proper money, but 50 million won. Yeah.
It's a lot.
It's a lot, yeah.
Sounds like a lot.
Yeah. Probably a won is like a yen, I'd guess, maybe.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. So there's a large population of foreign English teachers in the country. And as you said, the teachers are sometimes suspected of being undesirable. So there was a story that I found a little while ago about a vigilante group called the Anti-English Spectrum, which sounds like a group of Batman villains or something. And they stalked English teachers to check that they weren't molesting kids or doing drugs.
Okay.
And the leader of the group responded to criticism by saying, "It's not stalking, it's following, and there's no law against that."
Where have we heard that before?
So this was in the past, but recently there's been an incident which has been reported quite widely, where dozens of young English teachers have been arrested on drugs charges. So this happened on August the 20th of this year, 2014. Two smugglers were responsible for bringing the drugs into the country. One of them was a Korean national with US residence, and the other one was a Korean American. And they brought 2 kilograms of hemp into the country through the US military mail, which makes me think the military should be checking their mail a bit more carefully.
Too busy redacting things.
Yeah. And both of the smugglers were actually working as English teachers at the time. They sold the drugs to Nigerian and Korean dealers who were selling them to the public. And most of the drug buyers among the public were mostly were young English teachers working in colleges, elementary schools, private schools, kindergartens even. In fact, one of the dealers who was caught was a Nigerian who was actually found to have taught her to kindergarten while under the influence of marijuana.
Wow.
So there you go.
Okay.
So it's just one incident. It's maybe not indicative of the industry as a whole, but I think it's worth discussing whether incidents like this are responsible for giving English teachers and the English teaching profession a bad name.
Yeah.
So I remember one of my students when I first came to Japan, he was asking me a little about English teachers, and I said, "Why are you interested?" And he said, "Because English teachers cause trouble around the world. I read on the internet they are bad news." And so I think it increases the likelihood that teachers fall under suspicion of that kind of thing, and that has knock-on effects like harsher background checks, random drug testing, and so on. So what do you think? Do you think this is a serious issue for the image of the TEFL industry?
This has got to be an isolated incident, is it not?
Well, I mean, it depends based on what you were saying before, Matthew.
Right. And I think the point is that there is this image in certain parts of the world that TEFLers have. I think actually it would be nice to have distinct terms for.
Yeah.
So I think basically the way that the industry or the market is set up makes it almost inevitable that people who are not really teachers or not interested in language teaching end up in jobs that are nominally called language teaching. The market is so big and there's enough money to be made through it that people hire anybody that they can get.
Yeah, and another problem is that when most people who eventually become real teachers when they start their careers, they're not very qualified. Maybe a lot of them don't intend to continue in it.
Yeah.
So it's built into the fabric of the industry, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of teachers, again,
just air quote teachers.
I'm using my hands here. That kind of they do teaching as a means to an end, like we talked about with John Haycraft. They do it because they want to go travelling and they want to have fun.
Yeah.
And teaching is just something they do during the day to get money to party.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, that's not true for a lot of people, obviously. But yeah, I think like what Matthew was saying, like there should be a different term for those kind of people.
Well, I think TEFLers is a pretty a pretty good term.
TEFLers and TEFLologists.
Exactly.
Is that the distinction?
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction. Yeah.
But I think certainly like English language teachers get more rap than say like a builder or an engineer doing this kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, why is it that English teachers get they're under the magnifying glass with these kind of problems?
Yeah, well, maybe we should think about some examples of this. So, do you have any experiences of teachers behaving badly in countries where you've been teaching, or like maybe friends or colleagues, anything like that? Naming no names, of course.
Yeah, I mean, actually, in England, it is a summer school in England, which is a company will rent a school in the middle of the countryside in England and have international students over. Probably students are paying a lot of money, but they'll hire anybody to teach the students. Not only teach them in the morning, do activities. But and naturally, the teachers also live in the school, and you're in the middle of nowhere, so there's a pub down the road. So it's very common for all the teachers to, bond and drink and do all kinds of things.
Yeah.
But there was one instructor or teacher who was found, I think a few weeks into the course, was drinking vodka in class,
right?
in the morning, a little white plastic cup, and the students noticed.
Yeah.
She was never fired. This teacher was never fired.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just because it's too much pain to find a new teacher in the middle of the course.
Yeah, that might be another issue with the the behaviour if no one challenges it.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
We've had experience of working in Eikaiwa schools here, conversation schools, and I mean we've had experiences of colleagues coming into the classroom drunk or very hungover, being sick in the classroom, chasing the students. Chasing the students after hours.
I see.
Chasing their tails.
We once worked with someone who he routinely came into class, put on the Lion King DVD, and just sat at the back of the class and slept, and that was his lesson.
Right.
Very hands-off approach.
That's more pedagogically questionable rather than.
But he didn't get sacked for that. He
did that for years.
The students presumed that's what the course was, and thought nothing of it. Yeah,
it's the Lion King. That was like the end of year lesson at school. Like the last lesson, you've got nothing else to do. Let's watch the Lion King.
Every lesson. Yeah. It was the Lion King every lesson as well.
Yeah, they must have known that film really well by the end of it.
They probably came out with great English, like certain phrases they automatized from the Lion King.
Yeah. So do you think that this kind of thing is a serious issue in TEFL? Do you think this is something that we should be trying to eradicate? And how could that be accomplished? I
spent many years, people ask me what I do, and I'd kind of defensively, sheepishly say, well, I'm an English language teacher. And they'd say, oh yeah, my cousin does that. He's 12 or whatever.
He's backpacking at the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
He's got a textbook in
and
his
I'd
bag.
say, right. And you say, well, no, but and you try to explain why you're more of a language teacher than other people who do it.
Well, you're a TEFLologist as opposed to a TEFLer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'm a real teacher.
Yeah. And eventually I got bored of saying that. I just say I'm an English language teacher. Whatever. But I remember, I think Scott Thornbury says he, like in the airport, at passport control, he identifies himself as an applied linguist, which is one way of getting out of saying I'm an English teacher. But he is basically an English language teacher, right?
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's part of the problem. Like the people you mentioned, the drug smugglers, they bring the whole kind of industry down for the ones like us.
Yeah.
I think like us, who actually want to be real teachers. And,
Yeah,
you know.
but I think it's difficult to control for that kind of behaviour because, as we were saying, it's sort of woven into the way the industry works, and it's going to be very difficult to change that without also denying those early employment opportunities for people who do go on to take it more seriously. Yeah, so I think it's a difficult issue, but we'd like to encourage our listeners not to do drugs in the classroom. Don't smuggle hemp into any countries where you work.
That's the
and if you do, hopefully we didn't influence you to do that. And that's the news for this week. TEFL Cultures.
Okay, so for this week's TEFL Cultures, I'd like to talk about one particular methodology or way of teaching that's perhaps slightly defunct now or not very popular these days. But before I introduce it, so I just want to ask, when you speak to non-TEFLers, people that are outside our profession,
TEFLologists.
have you ever asked them, how do you think we teach? What do you think we do in the class? Or what do you think they'd say if you asked them?
I've had people who have they've asked me what I do, and they've said things like, so before I came to Japan, I had people asking me, so do you speak Japanese?
Right.
I was like, no, obviously not.
So how are you going to teach English?
Exactly, yeah.
So when it comes down to that, I kind of find myself kind of saying, well, we use other methods, we use other ways. We often point to things in class. We often get students to look at our actions. We kind of introduce things by kind of non-verbal means first, I guess, kind of thing. And then I thought, well, hang on, what I'm telling these people is that pretty much like the TPR approach to English language teaching, to an extent. If you're not familiar with the TPR approach, that stands for, well, what does it stand for?
Total
physical
response.
Good. Okay. So for today's section, I'm going to be talking about TPR, total physical response. Just to give it a bit of background, it was devised by James Asher in the 1970s. It was very popular during the 70s and 80s, but I think today it's incorporated into other methodologies, but it's not seen as one that's particularly prominent, I guess, these days. TPR is a teaching method which incorporates physical movement with language, essentially. So a lot of mimicry, a lot of drilling, touching things in the class, movement, that kind of thing. It's very materials light. There's not a great deal of Realia used at first, but I think later on it is incorporated. And in terms of the linguistic load, the teacher would often introduce maybe a verb with a collection of vocabulary, essentially, and make connections that way. And it would work with imperatives, the teacher asking questions or giving commands and the students replying.
Like, for example?
For example, if I was going to give... the example I was thinking about earlier was like, brush your teeth, and then they maybe point to their teeth or touch...
Mime a toothbrush.
Where do you brush your teeth? In the bathroom, and then maybe they'd go to a picture of a bathroom, or they'd do some kind of action. That's kind of how one example perhaps of a TPR approach. The argument is that the mental conditions on the students are being reduced because they're moving around. It's very physical. It's kind of fun. And it kind of crosses over into Krashen's idea of the affective filter, so that if the learners are in the correct mental frame of minds, they're going to be more likely to acquire language. So that's kind of the crossover there, basically. So the learning goals are that it's very action based, and the students are copying the teacher, they're performing, they're doing, but some criticisms are obviously that it is very teacher fronted. In a sense, have you ever used TPR in your lessons?
Only with kids, I think. So I've worked with very small children, and basically I didn't know how to teach really at the time. I'd never been trained in teaching kids, so it was a lot of run and touch, like find something red, and they'd run and slap red things in the room, find something blue, and that kind of thing. I've never used it with adults, I think.
Well, Asher's idea is that first language learning has some parallels with second language learning, and it seems very outdated to kind of say that now. I'm not sure I agree with that either, but he kind of equates it to the same way. So in terms of feedback, for example, the mother and the child, or the father and the child, would give more feedback as time goes on and kind of tolerate less, essentially.
Yeah.
And that kind of flies in the face of what we kind of know today, where we kind of give less feedback in a sense, and we kind of listen and take a back step in the class. But in the TPR approach, the teacher tolerates less as time goes on. So it seems very teacher-fronted in this respect.
I mean, there are ways of getting around that is that students give each other things to do. I used, with kids, again, I used to do a thing called robots, where they'd all first they'd come up with their own robot name, and they'd write commands for each other to give. And first I'd be the head robot, get them all to obey me, and then they'd tell each other what to do. And just things like walk around the room, or just silly things. And I wrote a little article about that, and then the editor of the article she asked me to come up with kind of other. So I think that one of the criticisms is that TPR is often for low-level learners, and maybe young learners. So thinking of ways of coming up with more advanced language structures. So one thing I came up, which I never tried, was, and the kind of real-life example I could think of was a director with an actor. So a director directing somebody, saying, okay, now you're gonna look at the sun, and you're gonna think about where you're going next, or you could incorporate any kinds of vocabulary or any kind of structures.
It seems like it could be very closely related to task-based learning, I guess. But what I think of when I think of a TPR role play is something that's very repetitive and not something that's all that authentic. So maybe what you said is perhaps could be authentic, I guess. But I guess in general the approach is very behaviourist, in the sense that you were the head robot. You're the leader. You're telling the students what to do.
There's a lot of drilling involved. A lot of repetition, trying to get those structures into the heads of the students.
I guess a kind of listening drill. Students hear the target language a lot.
But although when you make them into little robots, perhaps then they're producing it a bit more as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you familiar? So Asher's idea was that there's some sort of Bioprogram developed, whereby listening should be accompanied by physical movement, with speech following after that in that particular order. It's all about comprehension, and
I'm suspicious about these kinds of things, like a Bioprogram, because it seems like it's an assertion without anything behind it. It's kind of a hunch, like he's it's almost like it's more of an analogy than an actual principle.
Right.
There seemed to be little research that I could find, but he kind of talks about the right side of the brain is enacted more with TPR than the left side of the brain.
And we know that right side, left side it's not a very good distinction. Nowadays, of course, he didn't know that at the time.
I mean, and the other thing maybe that I thought about with TPR is that the identifying it as physical seems to be kind of contrasting it with other language use.
Right.
But I think any language use or that kind of communicative behavior is all physical. So
but it's more of a contrived physical response.
Right.
See what I mean?
Yeah.
CPR.
Maybe that. Right.
So so you talked about some of the criticisms. It kind of has a natural endpoint at very beginner learners, essentially, and also maybe some of the dialogues are very contrived as well, and not focused on form. They're focused a lot on meaning. So literally listening to the whole meaning of what the teacher says, and then if the teacher asks a question, the students have to reply or do something in the correct manner, basically.
Right.
Just to end this section, I found something that Scott Thornbury used in one of his presentations called The Secret History of Methods. It's on YouTube.
I've seen
and he basically talks about this weird scenario that he found in a 1950s textbook, where it had people in particular actions, but some of the phrases they were teaching were, this is your mouth, this is my mouth. Maybe point to your mouth, point to someone else's mouth. You take your hand off my arm. My finger is on my chin. So what the learners are doing there, they're listening basically to my, your, you, and they're actually pointing or doing physical things, kind of like a game of Twister in the classroom. I take my foot off your head. Your hand is on your knee.
Yeah. It sounds like an ESL version of the Kama Sutra.
So it's kind of unbelievable and very unrealistic, but these were probably characteristic of what maybe students would books and things like that. Like chop an onion, peel a tomato, that kind of thing.
If they actually had onions and tomatoes, that would be fine, I think.
Yeah.
So does it make a lot of use of Realia, however you say that? I'm terrible with pronouncing words. Realia.
It seems like it does. It seems like it could still work just with drawings and the teacher's voice and actions and that kind of thing. But I think Realia should be used to make it more interesting, obviously.
And how much of this do you think is incorporated into kind of a more of a post-methods approach? Do you find yourself using this in the classroom very often? Do you think it's something that gets used very often in the classroom?
Not in my current context. I don't think.
Yeah, I don't use it again, we're in the same context. I don't use it very much now. I guess I did, as I said, with kids, not with adults. How about you?
Yeah. No, not really. No, I don't think I do, actually.
So it really is a defunct method then.
Obviously we're teaching kind of discussion skills, right? So, can you think of any ways how it could be incorporated? I guess you could make the actual presentation of certain phrases more physical around the room, how you actually present them to the class.
Yeah, the kind of target language we present, which is functional language, doesn't really lend itself to it so much.
No, I think it'd be very difficult to incorporate. Yeah.
Sorry.
So that was today's TEFL Culture, all about total physical response, TPR.
TEFL Pioneers.
Okay, for this episode's pioneer, we're going back to the 16th century. I think the furthest back we've been so far.
Great.
To a man called William Bullokar. That's how I'm going to pronounce it.
Yeah, that's probably the best way to pronounce it.
Bullokar. Bullokar.
Okay.
Bullokar.
Yeah, let's go with that.
So he was born in 1531 in England somewhere.
Which county is somewhere in?
somewhere, sure. So I guess he's best known for writing the first English grammar. And by grammar I mean a book detailing the rules of the language.
Okay, nice.
So he was also a spelling reformer and a grammarian. So maybe the interesting thing about this is, the first existing English grammar. It's possible that there were ones previous to him. But it's the only one. There are 2 copies still remain. One in Oxford and one both in Oxford actually.
Okay.
Before his what he calls his one's called the pamphlet for grammar. Very nicely, it's prefaced with the full title is Bullokar's Pamphlet for Grammar, or rather, to be said, his abbreviation of his grammar for English, extracted out of his grammar at large. So I think he wanted to make it very clear that he wrote a longer one, and we're just getting the shortened version until he gets around to writing his long one. He never did.
Yeah. What's the subtitle of TEFLology? Is it TEFLology or to be said? The collected musings.
As ours abbreviation.
It's like what we were talking about earlier, the Large Hadron Collider. We are the large TEFLology. There is a smaller one apparently. That's what we were saying.
Yeah. So before he wrote this, or before this became widely known, his pamphlet for grammar, English wasn't considered to have grammar.
Right.
Which is his writing this was actually a very big deal. Not just because somebody actually sat down and wrote it out, but in terms of the image of the English language. He based what he wrote on Lilly's grammar, which is a very famous book describing the grammar of Latin. And at that time, every school child learned Latin. Latin was considered the ultimate language, the best language, and everything was considered to descend from Latin.
Right.
Latin was considered what he called a ruled language, and English was not considered a ruled language. In other words, it didn't have rules, it was just a vernacular,
right.
Something people used to communicate with. Bullokar realized that English was ruled, and part of this realization came about because he traveled and he saw that other people trying to use English were obviously maybe misusing it or using it in ways that to him sounded unruled.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Right. So no one before this realised that there were kind of patterns to how English was used.
That's well, who knows? Yeah, you would think that some people must have realized that. But maybe not. He came to it. Well, he came to it from two directions. First, he was a spelling reformer, so he wanted to, as I'm sure you know, the spelling of English up until not so long ago was very haphazard. You could write things in many different ways.
Yeah.
He came up with his own phonetic way of writing, so he decided however many 24 letters wasn't enough, so he came up with a whole bunch of other ones to represent different sounds. He wanted there to be standardized spelling, and I think maybe through this idea that the spelling of the language could be standardized, and looking at the grammar of Latin, he realized that English could also be standardized in terms of its rules, its patterns.
Yeah.
He's maybe the first one we have to blame for this idea of, there are these famous rules about English, don't end a clause with a preposition, these things, which famously come from people imposing the rules of Latin on English.
Yeah.
And it starts with him, basically. He recognized that English had its own rules, but he still thought that they all came from Latin.
It's kind of like Latin was the perfect form of what a language is.
Yeah.
And then you just sort of try to overlay English on the top of that.
Yeah.
Kind of like, was it Plato's cave? With the shadows on the wall. A little bit. Yes.
So he approached the English grammar from the Latin grammar. He actually took kind of almost verbatim some of the phrasing from the
Do you have any examples of things like items that he said should be a rule?
Things that he took from Latin.
Yeah, do this, don't
and
say
imposed
this.
onto English.
You must say this.
I haven't read his pamphlet for grammar. What he did do is he started, as Latin was taught then, he started with parts of speech.
Okay.
And interestingly, he didn't. So, for example, the articles a and the he just didn't include because Latin doesn't have them. So he just considered them just little words that we use at the beginning of noun phrases.
Yeah, that's how most of our students consider them as well.
Yes, that's right. And even adjectives were just part of noun phrases.
Right.
So the other thing is, obviously, Latin is much more. Words in Latin have many declensions, which English doesn't.
Yeah.
So he tried to find as many declensions in English as he could, but kind of ran out very quickly.
Right.
And also, Latin has a lot more cases. It has genitives and ablatives and things. Maybe English has some of those somewhere.
Some of them somewhere sometimes.
Yeah, but not really that relevant.
Yeah.
However, this idea of using Latin to look at English, he should be given a bit more credit, apparently, that his grammar was intended as a way for people to learn English. And so he decided that using the rules of Latin were a good way, an easy way for students who had already learned Latin in this way to learn English.
Right.
He did actually recognize, some of his writings recognize that he did understand that English was its own distinctive language.
So there was a pragmatic choice involved there as well.
Yeah,
right.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah,
it's interesting. And I guess that the application of standards and stuff, that's something that continued for quite a long time. I don't know if people still do that now. Like if they set down these new prescriptive rules very often about things.
New rules.
New rules. Yeah.
There was something I read recently. Something talking about aspect should be taught more rather than particular tenses, like the idea of tense being not abandoned, but we should consider aspect more as a new kind of model or a new re-evaluation of these kind of old rules.
Yeah, well, I think that
was. But.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that probably comes from all of these textbooks that were written, which are, I think, maybe what Bullokar's pamphlet started was this idea of learning languages by dividing it into grammatical terms. which he did part of. And so, you look at Headway, you look at these books, and they're divided by grammatical terms. Obviously, they're simplified, and so they call something like the present perfect, they call that a tense.
Yeah.
And obviously, that's a tense and an aspect.
Right.
And treating it in that way.
Yeah. And so, to what extent do you think the way that grammars work now are similar or different to the way that his grammar worked?
I think surprisingly similar. I mean, I think what he wrote could be considered the first English language learning book. That's what it was designed for. It's interesting. It seems to be designed for both people learning English and for English speakers themselves to refer to.
Yeah. I guess that would be kind of like the early dictionaries. Like there were loads of word lists and stuff before Johnson's dictionary, but they weren't really designed for language learners for the most part. They were designed for people. They were just trying to compile sort of
grammar used to be an
actual
subject, didn't it, in most
like grammar schools.
Not grammar school, but what I mean, it wasn't for language learners. It was for young people to get a grasp of language.
Another thing he also wanted to show with this was that Latin was always taught through English, through the medium of English.
Right.
And he wanted to show that a language could be taught through its own medium.
Yeah.
So all the Lilly's grammar of Latin was a book about Latin grammar, but it was written in English for the most part. And he wanted to show that a foreigner, that's the terms he used, but a non-English speaking student could learn English just through a book using only English. Right. So maybe the first English-only policy as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because that attitude didn't resurface for quite a long time. When we started talking about the direct method in sort of the 1800s, for a very long time, everything was still done through grammar translation with Francois Gouin, was that his name? That we spoke about? Yeah. People were still doing things mainly through translation, not teaching using the language, the target language as the language of instruction. Yeah. Right. It's strange that there was that ebb and flow over history.
Yeah. So I think he definitely maybe started this idea of finding ways to package language in more manageable forms.
Grammar McNuggets.
Yeah, which again only until recently we've started to move away from. But certainly an important work in terms of the development of language books. Okay, so that's it for this episode's pioneer, William Bullokar.
Okay, so thanks for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed it, as always.
And if you'd like to get in contact with us, please send an email to teflology@gmail.com. We've noticed that there are a few new listeners to the podcast in the last few weeks, so we'd like to say welcome to the podcast, and I think we need a word to describe fans of the show, and I'm suggesting for that TEFLolophiles. So for all of you listeners, you are now officially TEFLolophiles. And for you people who hate the show, you are TEFLolophobes, and no one wants to be one of those. So we'll see you next time. So it's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from me.
Goodbye.